quarters of a mile through tallows and the crates. I only remember falling down the stairs that led to Trappist's basement, my purse of money clutched tight in my hand. As I lay there shivering and sweating, I heard the faint slapping of his bare feet on the stone. What? He said gently as he picked me up. Hush, hush. Trappist nursed me through the long days of my fever. He wrapped me in blankets, fed me, and when my fever showed no signs of breaking on its own, he used the money I'd brought to buy a bittersweet medicine. He kept my face and hands wet and cool while murmuring his patient, gentle, what? Hush, hush. While I cried out from endless fever dreams of my dead parents, the Chandrian, and a man with empty eyes. I awoke clear-headed and cool. "Uri!" Tanny said loudly from where he was tied to his cot. What? Hush, hush, Tanny, Trappist said as he put down one of the babies and picked up the other. It looked around owlishly with wide, dark eyes, but seemed unable to support its own head. It was quiet in the room. "Ooh-wee!" Tanny said again. I coughed, trying to clear my throat. "There's a cup on the floor next to you," Trappist said, brushing a hand along the head of the baby he held. "Ooh! Ooh! Ooh-wee! Tanny bellowed, strange half-gasps punctuating his cry. The noise agitated several of the others who moved restlessly in their cots. The older boy sitting in the corner raised his hands to the sides of his head and began to moan. He started rocking back and forth, gently at first, but then more and more violently, so that when he came forward his head knocked against the bare stone of the wall. Trappist was at his side before the boy could do himself any real harm. He put his arms around the rocking boy. "Hush, hush, Lonnie, hush, hush." The boy's rocking slowed, but did not entirely subside. "Tanny, you know better than to make all that noise." His voice was serious, but not stern. "Why are you making trouble? Lonnie could hurt himself." "Ooh-yay," Tanny said softly. I thought I could detect a note of remorse in his voice. "I think he wants a story," I said, surprising myself by speaking. "Ah," Tanny said. "Is that what you want, Tanny?" "Ah." There was a quiet moment. "I don't know any stories," he said. Tanny remained stubbornly silent. Everyone knows one story, I thought. Everyone knows at least one. "Ooh-wee!" Trappist looked around at the quiet room, as if looking for an excuse. "Well," he said reluctantly, "it has been a while since we had a story, hasn't it?" He looked down at the boy in his arms. "Would you like a story, Lonnie?" Lonnie nodded a violent affirmation, nearly battering Trappist's cheek with the back of his head. "Will you be good and sit by yourself so I can tell a story?" Lonnie stopped rocking almost immediately. Trappist slowly unwrapped his arms and stepped away. After a long look to make sure the boy wouldn't hurt himself, he stepped carefully back to his chair. "Well," he muttered softly to himself as he stooped to pick up the baby he had set aside. "Do I have a story?" He spoke very quietly to the child's wide eyes. No, I don't. Can I remember one? I suppose I had better." He sat for a long moment, humming to the child in his arms, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Yes, of course." He sat up taller in his chair. "Are you ready?" This is a story from long ago, back before any of us were born, before our fathers were born, too. It was a long time ago, maybe 400 years, no more than that, probably 1,000 years, but maybe not quite as much as that. It was a bad time in the world. People were hungry and sick. There were famines and great plagues. There were many wars and other bad things in this time because there was no one to stop them. But the worst thing in this time was that there were demons walking the land. Some of them were small and troublesome, creatures who lamed horses and spoiled milk. But there were many worse than those. There were demons who hid in men's bodies and made them sick or mad, but those were not the worst. There were demons like great beasts that would catch and eat men while they were still alive and screaming, but they were not the worst. Some demons stole the skins of men and wore them like clothes, but even they were not the worst. There was one demon that stood above the others, Encanis, the swallowing darkness. No matter where he walked, shadows hid his face, and scorpions that stung him died of the corruption they had touched. Now Telu, who made the world and who was Lord over all, watched the world of men. He saw that demons made sport of us, and killed us, and ate our bodies. Some men he saved, but only a few. For Telu is just, and saves only the worthy, and in these times few men acted even for their own good, let alone the good of others. Because of this, Telu was unhappy, for he had made the world to be a good place for men to live. But his church was corrupt. They stole from the poor and did not live by the laws he had given. No, wait. There was no church yet, and no priests either. Just men and women, and some of them knew who Telu was. But even those were wicked. So when they called on Lord Telu for help, he felt no desire to aid them. But after years of watching and waiting, Telu saw a woman pure of heart and spirit. Her name was Periel. Her mother had raised her to know Telu, and she worshipped him as well as her poor circumstances allowed. Although her own life was hard, Periel prayed only for others and never for herself. Telu watched her for long years. He saw her life was hard, full of misfortune and torment at the hands of demons and bad men. But she never cursed his name or ceased her praying, and she never treated any person other than with kindness and respect. So late one night, Telu went to her in a dream. He stood before her and seemed to be made entirely of fire or sunlight. He came to her in splendor and asked her if she knew who he was. "Sure enough," she said. You see, she was very calm about it because she thought she was just having an odd dream. "You're Lord Telu." He nodded and asked her if she knew why he had come to her. "Are you going to do something for my neighbor Deborah?" she asked, because that's who she had prayed for before she went to sleep. "Are you going to lay your hand on her husband Losel and make him a better man? The way he treats her isn't right. Man should never lay a hand on woman save in love." Telu knew her neighbors. He knew they were wicked people who had done wicked things. Everyone in the village was wicked but her. Everyone in the world was. He told her so. "Deborah has been very kind and good to me," Periel said. "And even Losel, who I don't care for, is one of my neighbors all the same." Telu told her that Deborah spent time in many different men's beds, and Losel drank every day of the week, even on morning. No, wait, there wasn't any morning yet, but he drank a lot at any rate. Sometimes he grew so angry that he beat his wife until she could not stand or even cry aloud. Periel was quiet for a long moment in her dream. She knew Telu spoke the truth, but while Periel was pure of heart, she was not a fool. She had suspected her neighbors of doing the things Telu said. Even now that she knew for certain, she cared for her neighbors all the same. "You won't help her?" Telu said that the man and wife were each other's fitting punishment. They were wicked, and the wicked should be punished. Periel spoke out honestly, perhaps because she thought she was dreaming, but perhaps she would have said the same thing had she been awake, for Periel said what was in her heart. "It's not their fault that the world is full of hard choices and hunger and loneliness," she said. "What can you expect of people when demons are their neighbors?" But though Telu listened to her wise words with his ears, he told her that mankind was wicked, and the wicked should be punished. "I think you know very little about what it is to be a man," she said, "and I would still help them if I could," she told him resolutely. "So you shall," Telu told her, and reached out to lay his hand on her heart. When he touched her, she felt like she were a great golden bell that had just rung out its first note. She opened her eyes and knew then that it had been no normal dream. Thus it was that she was not surprised to discover she was pregnant. In 3 months she gave birth to a perfect, dark-eyed baby boy. She named him Menda. The day after he was born, Menda could crawl. In 2 days he could walk. Periel was surprised, but not worried, for she knew the child was a gift from God. Nevertheless, Periel was wise. She knew that people might not understand, so she kept Menda close by her, and when her friends and neighbors came to visit, she sent them away. But this could only last a little while, for in a small town there are no secrets. Folk knew that Periel was not married, and while children born out of wedlock were common during this time, children who grew to manhood in less than 2 months were not. They were afraid that she might have lain down with a demon, and that her child was a demon's child. Such things were not unheard of in those dark times, and the people were afraid. So everyone gathered together on the first day of the 7th span, and made their way to the tiny house where Periel lived by herself with her son. The town smith, whose name was Rengen, led them. "Show us the boy," he yelled, but there was no response from the house. "Bring out the boy and show us he is nothing but a human child." The house remained quiet, and though there were many men among them, no one wanted to enter a house that might have a demon's child inside. So the smith cried out again, "Periel, bring out young Menda, or we will burn your house around you." The door opened, and a man stepped out. None of them recognized who it was, because even though he was only 7 span from the womb, Menda looked to be a young man of 17. He stood proud and tall, with coal-black hair and eyes. "I am the one you think is Menda," he said in a voice both powerful and deep. "What do you want of me?" The sound of his voice made Periel gasp inside the cottage. Not only was this the first time Menda had ever spoken, but she recognized his voice as the same one that had spoken to her in a dream months ago. "What do you mean, we think you are Menda?" asked the smith, gripping his hammer tightly. He knew that there were demons that looked like men, or wore their skins like costumes, the way a man might hide beneath a sheepskin. The child who was not a child spoke again. "I am Periel's son, but I am not Menda, and I am not a demon." "Touch the iron of my hammer, then," said Rengen, for he knew all demons feared 2 things, cold iron and clean fire. He held out his heavy forge hammer. It shook in his hands, but no one thought the less of him for it. He who was not Menda stepped forward and laid both hands on the iron head of the hammer. Nothing happened. From the doorway of her house where she watched, Periel burst into tears, for though she trusted Tehlu, some part of her had held a mother's worry for her son. "I am not Menda, though that is what my mother called me. I am Tehlu, Lord above all. I have come to free you from demons and the wickedness of your own hearts. I am Tehlu, son of myself. Let the wicked hear my voice and tremble." And they did tremble, but some of them refused to believe. They called him a demon and threatened him. They spoke hard, frightened words. Some threw stones and cursed him and spat toward him and his mother. Then Tehlu grew angry, and he might have slain them all. But Periel leaped forward and laid a restraining hand on his shoulder. "What more can you expect," she asked him quietly, "from men who live with demons for their neighbors? Even the best dog will bite that has been kicked enough." Tehlu considered her words and saw that she was wise, so he looked over his hands at Rengen, looked deep into his heart, and said, "Rengen, son of Engen, you have a mistress who you pay to lie with you. Some men come to you for work, and you cheat or steal from them. And though you pray loudly, you do not believe I, Tehlu, made the world and watch over all who live here. When Rengen heard this, he grew pale and dropped his hammer to the ground. For what Tehlu said to him was true. Tehlu looked at all the men and women there. He looked into their hearts and spoke of what he saw. All of them were wicked, so much that Rengen was among the best of them. Then Tehlu drew a line in the dirt of the road so that it lay between himself and all those who had come. This road is like the meandering course of a life. There are two paths to take, side by side. Each of you are already traveling that side. You must choose. Stay on your own path or cross to mine. But the road is the same, isn't it? It still goes to the same place, someone asked. Yes. Where does the road lead? Death. All lives end in death, excepting one. Such is the way of things. Then what does it matter which side a man is on? It was Rengen asking these questions. He was a large man, one of the few that was taller than dark-eyed Tehlu, but he was shaken by all that he had seen and heard in the past few hours. What is on our side of the road? Pain, Tehlu said in a voice as hard and cold as stone. Punishment. And your side? Pain now, Tehlu said in the same voice. Punishment now for all that you have done. It cannot be avoided. But I am here too. This is my path. How do I cross? Regret, repent, and cross to me. Rengen stepped over the line to stand beside his god. Then Tehlu bent to pick up the hammer that the smith had dropped. But instead of giving it back, he struck Rengen with it as if it were a lash, once, twice, thrice, and the third blow sent Rengen to his knees, sobbing and crying out in pain. But after the third blow, Tehlu laid the hammer aside and knelt to look Rengen in the face. You were the first to cross, he said softly, so only the smith could hear. It was a brave thing, a hard thing to do. I am proud of you. You are no longer Rengen. Now you are Wereth, the forger of the path. Then Tehlu embraced him with both arms, and his touch took much of the pain from Rengen, who is now Wereth. But not all, for Tehlu spoke truly when he said that punishment cannot be avoided. One by one they crossed, and one by one Tehlu struck them down with the hammer. But after each man or woman fell, Tehlu knelt and spoke to them, giving them new names and healing some of their hurt. Many of the men and women had demons hiding inside them that fled screaming when the hammer touched them. These people Tehlu spoke with a while longer, but he always embraced them in the end, and they were all grateful. Some of them danced for the joy of being free of such terrible things living inside them. In the end, 7 stayed on the other side of the line. Tehlu asked them 3 times if they would cross, and 3 times they refused. After the third asking, Tehlu sprang across the line and he struck each of them a great blow, driving them to the ground. But not all were men. When Tehlu struck the 4th, there was the sound of quenching iron and the smell of burning leather. For the 4th man had not been a man at all, but a demon wearing a man's skin. When it was revealed, Tehlu grabbed the demon and broke it in his hands, cursing its name and sending it back to the outer darkness that is the home of its kind. The remaining 3 let themselves be struck down. None of them were demons, though demons fled the bodies of some who fell. After he was done, Tehlu did not speak to the 6 who did not cross, nor did he kneel to embrace them and ease their wounds. The next day, Tehlu set off to finish what he had begun. He walked from town to town, offering each village he met the same choice he had given before. Always the results were the same. Some crossed, some stayed, some were not men at all but demons, and those he destroyed. But there was one demon who eluded Tehlu, Encanis, whose face was all in shadow. Encanis, whose voice was like a knife in the minds of men. Wherever Telu stopped to offer men the choice of path, Encanis had been there just before, killing crops and poisoning wells. Encanis setting men to murder one another and stealing children from their beds at night. At the end of 7 years, Telu's feet had carried him all through the world. He had driven out the demons that plagued us, all but one. Encanis ran free and did the work of 1,000 demons, destroying and despoiling wherever he went. So Telu chased, and Encanis fled. Soon Telu was a span of days behind the demon, then 2 days, then half a day. Finally he was so close he felt the chill of Encanis's passing and could spy places where he had set his hands and feet, for they were marked with a cold black frost. Knowing he was pursued, Encanis came to a great city. The Lord of Demons called forth his power, and the city was brought to ruin. He did this, hoping Telu would delay so he could make his escape. But the walking god paused only to appoint priests who cared for the people of the ruined town. For 6 days Encanis fled, and 6 great cities he destroyed. But on the 7th day Telu drew near before Encanis could bring his power to bear, and the 7th city was saved. That is why 7 is a lucky number, and why we celebrate on Chayan. Encanis was now hard-pressed and bent his whole thought upon escape. But on the 8th day, Telu did not pause to sleep or eat, and thus it was that at the end of felling, Telu caught Encanis. He leapt on the demon and struck him with his forge hammer. Encanis fell like a stone, but Telu's hammer shattered and lay in the dust of the road. Telu carried the demon's limp body all through the long night, and on the morning of the 9th day he came to the city of Atur. When men saw Telu carrying the demon's senseless form, they thought Encanis dead, but Telu knew that such a thing was not easily done. No simple blade or blow could kill him. No cell of bars could keep him safe within. So Telu carried Encanis to the smithy. He called for iron, and people brought all they owned. Though he had taken no rest, nor a morsel of food, all through the 9th day, Telu labored. While 10 men worked the bellows, Telu forged the great iron wheel. All night he worked, and when the first light of the 10th morning touched him, Telu struck the wheel one final time, and it was finished. Wrought all of black iron, the wheel stood taller than a man. It had 6 spokes, each thicker than a hammer's haft, and its rim was a handspan across. It weighed as much as 40 men and was cold to the touch. The sound of its name was terrible, and none could speak it. Telu gathered the people who were watching and chose a priest among them. Then he set them to dig a great pit in the center of the town, 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep. With the sun rising, Telu laid the body of the demon on the wheel. At the first touch of iron, Encanis began to stir in his sleep, but Telu chained him tightly to the wheel, hammering the links together, sealing them tighter than any lock. Then Telu stepped back, and all saw Encanis shift again, as if disturbed by an unpleasant dream. Then he shook and came awake entirely. Encanis strained against the chains, his body arching upward as he pulled against them. Where the iron touched his skin, it felt like knives and needles and nails, like the searing pain of frost, like the sting of 100 biting flies. Encanis thrashed on the wheel and began to howl as the iron burned and bit and froze him. To Telu the sound was like a sweet music. He lay down on the ground beside the wheel and slept a deep sleep, for he was very tired. When he awoke, it was evening of the 10th day. Encanis was still bound to the wheel, but he no longer howled and fought like a trapped animal. Telu bent and with great effort lifted one edge of the wheel and set it leaning against a tree that grew nearby. As soon as he came close, Encanis cursed him in languages no one knew, scratching and biting. "You brought this on yourself," Telu said. That night there was a celebration. Telu sent men to cut a dozen evergreens and use them to kindle a bonfire in the bottom of the deep pit they had dug. All night the townsfolk danced and sang around the burning fire. They knew the last and most dangerous of the world's demons was finally caught. And all night Incanus hung from his wheel and watched them, motionless as a snake. When the morning of the 11th day came, Tehlu went to Incanus a third and final time. The demon looked worn and feral. His skin was sallow, and his bones pressed tight against his skin. But his power still lay around him like a dark mantle, hiding his face in shadow. "Incanus," Tehlu said, "this is your last chance to speak. Do it, for I know it is within your power." "Lord Tehlu, I am not Incanus." For that brief moment, the demon's voice was pitiful, and all who heard it were moved to sorrow. But then there was a sound like quenching iron, and the wheel rung like an iron bell. Incanus's body arched painfully at the sound, then hung limply from his wrists as the ringing of the wheel faded. "Try no tricks, Dark One. Speak no lies," Tehlu said sternly, his eyes as dark and hard as the iron of the wheel. "What then?" Incanus hissed, his voice like the rasp of stone on stone. "What? Rack and shatter you! What do you want of me?" "Your road is very short, Incanus, but you may still choose a side on which to travel." Incanus laughed. "You will give me the same choice you give the cattle? Yes, then, I will cross to your side of the path. I regret and The wheel rung again, like a great bell tolling long and deep. Incanus threw his body tight against the chains again, and the sound of his scream shook the earth and shattered stones for 1/2 a mile in each direction. When the sounds of wheel and scream had faded, Incanus hung panting and shaking from his chains. "I told you to speak no lie, Incanus," Tehlu said, pitiless. "My path, then!" Incanus shrieked. "I do not regret. If I had my choice again, I would only change how fast I ran. Your people are like cattle my kind feed on, bite and break you. If you gave me 1/2 an hour, I would do such things that these wretched, gawping peasants would go mad with fear. I would drink their children's blood and bathe in women's tears." He might have said more, but his breath was short as he strained against the chains that held him. "So," Tehlu said, and stepped close to the wheel. For a moment it seemed like he would embrace Incanus, but he was merely reaching for the iron spokes of the wheel. Then, straining, Tehlu lifted the wheel above his head. He carried it, arms upstretched, toward the pit, and threw Incanus in. Through the long hours of night, a dozen evergreens had fed the fire. The flames had died in the early morning, leaving a deep bed of sullen coals that glimmered when the wind brushed them. The wheel struck flat, with Incanus on top. There was an explosion of spark and ash as it landed and sank inches deep into the hot coals. Incanus was held over the coals by the iron that bound and burned and bit at him. Though he was held away from the fire itself, the heat was so intense that Incanus's clothes charred black and began to crumble without bursting into flame. The demon thrashed against his bonds, settling the wheel more firmly into the coals. Incanus screamed, because he knew that even demons can die from fire or iron. And though he was powerful, he was bound and burning. He felt the metal of the wheel grow hot beneath him, blackening the flesh of his arms and legs. Incanus screamed, and even as his skin began to smoke and char, his face was still hidden in a shadow that rose from him like a tongue of darkening flame. Then Incanus grew silent, and the only sound was the hiss of sweat and blood as they fell from the demon's straining limbs. For a long moment, everything was still. Incanus strained against the chains that held him to the wheel, and it seemed that he would strain until his muscles tore themselves from bone and sinew both. Then there was a sharp sound like a bell breaking, and the demon's arm jerked free of the wheel. Links of chain, now glowing red from the heat of the fire, flew upward to land smoking at the feet of those who stood above. The only sound was the sudden, wild laughter of Incanus, like breaking glass. In a moment, the demon's second hand was free, but before he could do more, Tehlu flung himself into the pit and landed with such force that the iron rang with it. Tehlu grabbed the hands of the demon and pressed them back against the wheel. Incanus screamed in fury and in disbelief, for though he was forced back onto the burning wheel, and though he felt the strength of Tehlu was greater than the chains he had broken, he saw Tehlu was burning in the flames. "Fool!" he wailed. "You will die here with me! Let me go and live! Let me go and I will trouble you no further!" And the wheel did not ring out, for Incanus was truly frightened. "No," said Tehlu. "Your punishment is death. You will serve it." "Fool! Madling!" Incanus thrashed to no avail. "You are burning in the flames with me! You will die as I do!" To ash all things return, so too this flesh will burn. But I am Tehlu, son of myself, father of myself. I was before, and I will be after. If I am a sacrifice, then it is to myself alone. And if I am needed and called in the proper ways, then I will come again to judge and punish. So Tehlu held him to the burning wheel, and none of the demon's threats or screaming moved him the least part of an inch. So it was that Incanus passed from the world, and with him went Tehlu, who was Menda. Both of them burned to ash in the pit of Atur. That is why the Talin priests wear robes of ashen gray, and that is how we know Tehlu cares for us, and watches us, and keeps us safe from... Trappist broke off his story as Jaspin began to howl and thrash against his restraints. I slid softly back into unconsciousness as soon as I no longer had the story to hold my attention. After that, I began to harbor a suspicion that never entirely left me. Was Trappist a Talin priest? His robe was tattered and dirty, but it might have been the proper gray long ago. Parts of his story had been awkward and stumbling, but some were stately and grand, as if he'd been reciting them from some half-forgotten memory. Of sermons? Of his readings from the Book of the Path? I never asked. And though I stopped by his basement frequently in the months that followed, I never heard Trappist tell another story again. Chapter 24. Shadows Themselves. Through all my time in Tarbean, I continued to learn, though most of the lessons were painful and unpleasant. I learned how to beg. It was a very practical application of acting with a very difficult audience. I did it well, but waterside money was tight, and an empty begging bowl meant a cold, hungry night. Through dangerous trial and error, I discovered the proper way to slit a purse and pick a pocket. I was especially good at the latter. Locks and latches of all kinds soon gave up their secrets to me. My nimble fingers were put to a use my parents or Abinthy never would have guessed. I learned to run from anyone with an unnaturally white smile. Denner resin slowly bleaches your teeth, so if a sweet-eater lives long enough for their teeth to grow fully white, chances are they have already sold everything they have worth selling. Tarbean is full of dangerous people, but none as dangerous as a sweet-eater, filled with a desperate craving for more resin. They will kill you for a pair of pennies. I learned how to lash together makeshift shoes out of rags. Real shoes became a thing of dreams for me. The first 2 years it seemed like my feet were always cold, or cut, or both. But by the 3rd year my feet were like old leather, and I could run barefoot for hours over the rough stones of the city and not feel it at all. I learned not to expect help from anyone. In the bad parts of Tarbean, a call for help attracts predators like the smell of blood on the wind. I was sleeping on the rooftops, snug tightly into my secret place where 3 roofs met. I awoke from a deep sleep to the sound of harsh laughter and pounding feet in the alley below me. The slapping footsteps stopped, and more laughter followed the sound of ripping cloth. Slipping to the edge of the roof, I looked down to the alley below. I saw several large boys, almost men. They were dressed as I was, rags and dirt. There may have been 5, maybe 6 of them. They moved in and out of the shadows like shadows themselves. Their chests heaved from their run, and I could hear their breath from the roof above. The object of the chase was in the middle of the alley, a young boy, 8 years old at the most. One of the older boys was holding him down. The young boy's bare skin shone pale in the moonlight. There was another sound of ripping cloth, and the boy gave a soft cry that ended in a choked sob. The others watched and talked in low, urgent tones with each other, wearing hard, hungry smiles. I'd been chased before at night, several times. I'd been caught, too, months ago. Looking down, I was surprised to find a heavy red roof tile in my hand, ready to throw. Then I paused, looking back to my secret place. I had a rag blanket and half a loaf of bread there. My rainy day money was hidden here. 8 iron pennies I had hoarded for when my luck turned bad. And most valuable of all, Ben's book. I was safe here. Even if I hit one of them, the rest would be on the roof in 2 minutes. And then, even if I got away, I wouldn't have anywhere to go. I set down the tile. I went back to what had become my home, and curled myself into the shelter of the niche underneath the overhanging roof. I twisted my blanket in my hands and clenched my teeth, trying to shut out the low rumble of conversation, punctuated by coarse laughter and quiet, hopeless sobbing from below. Chapter 25. Interlude. Eager for reasons. Kvothe gestured for Chronicler to set down his pen and stretched, lacing his fingers together above his head. "It's been a long time since I remember that," he said. "If you are eager to find the reason I became the Kvothe they tell stories about, you could look there, I suppose." Chronicler's forehead wrinkled. "What do you mean, exactly?" Kvothe paused for a long moment, looking down at his hands. "Do you know how many times I've been beaten over the course of my life?" Chronicler shook his head. Looking up, Kvothe grinned and tossed his shoulders in a nonchalant shrug. "Neither do I. You'd think that sort of thing would stick in a person's mind. You'd think I would remember how many bones I've had broken. You'd think I'd remember the stitches and bandages." He shook his head. "I don't. I remember that young boy sobbing in the dark, clear as a bell after all these years." Chronicler frowned. "You said yourself that there was nothing you could have done." "I could have," Kvothe said seriously, "and I didn't. I made my choice, and I regret it to this day. Bones mend. Regret stays with you forever." Kvothe pushed himself away from the table. "That's enough of Tarbean's darker side, I imagine." He came to his feet and gave a great stretch, arms over his head. "Why, Reshi?" The words poured out of Bast in a sudden gush. "Why did you stay there when it was so awful?" Kvothe nodded to himself, as if he'd been expecting the question. "Where else was there for me to go, Bast? Everyone I knew was dead." "Not everyone," Bast insisted. "There was Abenthy. You could have gone to him." "Hallowfell was hundreds of miles away, Bast," Kvothe said wearily as he wandered to the other side of the room and moved behind the bar. "Hundreds of miles without my father's maps to guide me. Hundreds of miles without wagons to ride or sleep in. Without help of any sort, or money, or shoes. Not an impossible journey, I suppose, but for a young child, still numb with the shock of losing his parents—" Kvothe shook his head. "No. In Tarbean, at least, I could beg or steal. I'd managed to survive in the forest for a summer, barely. But over the winter—" He shook his head. "I would have starved or frozen to death." Standing at the bar, Kvothe filled his mug and began to add pinches of spice from several small containers, then walked toward the great stone fireplace, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You're right, of course. Anywhere would have been better than Tarbean." He shrugged, facing the fire. "But we are all creatures of habit. It is far too easy to stay in the familiar ruts we dig for ourselves. Perhaps I even viewed it as fair. My punishment for not being there to help when the Chandrian came. My punishment for not dying when I should have, with the rest of my family." Bast opened his mouth, then closed it, and looked down at the tabletop, frowning. Kvothe looked over his shoulder and gave a gentle smile. "I'm not saying it's rational, Bast. Emotions by their very nature are not reasonable things. I don't feel that way now, but back then I did. I remember." He turned back to the fire. "Ben's training has given me a memory so clean and sharp, I have to be careful not to cut myself sometimes." Kvothe took a mulling stone from the fire and dropped it into his wooden mug. It sank with a sharp hiss. The smell of searing clove and nutmeg filled the room. Kvothe stirred his cider with a long-handled spoon as he made his way back to the table. "You must also remember that I was not in my right mind. Much of me was still in shock, sleeping, if you will. I needed something, or someone, to wake me up." He nodded to Chronicler, who casually shook his writing hand to loosen it, then unstoppered his inkwell. Kvothe leaned back in his seat. "I needed to be reminded of things I had forgotten. I needed a reason to leave. It was years before I met someone who could do those things." He smiled at Chronicler. "Before I met Scarpi." Chapter 26. Lanre Turned. I had been in Tarbean for years at this point. 3 birthdays had slipped by unnoticed, and I was just past 15. I knew how to survive waterside. I had become an accomplished beggar and thief. Locks and pockets open to my touch. I knew which pawnshops bought goods from Uncle, with no questions asked. I was still ragged and frequently hungry, but I was in no real danger of starving. I had been slowly building my rainy day money. Even after a hard winter that had frequently forced me to pay for a warm spot to sleep, my hoard was over 20 iron pennies. It was like a dragon's treasure to me. I had grown comfortable there. But aside from the desire to add to my rainy day money, I had nothing to live for. Nothing driving me. Nothing to look forward to. My days were spent looking for things to steal and ways to entertain myself. But that had changed a few days earlier in Trapp's basement. I had heard a young girl speaking in an awed voice about a storyteller who spent all his time in a dockside bar called the Half-Mast. Apparently, every 6th bell he told a story. Any story you asked for, he knew. What's more, she said that he had a bet going. If he didn't know your story, he would give you a whole talent. I thought about what the girl had said for the rest of the day. I doubted it was true, but I couldn't help thinking about what I could do with a whole silver talent. I could buy shoes, and maybe a knife, give money to Trappist, and still double my rainy day fund. Even if the girl was lying about the bet, I was still interested. Entertainment was hard to come by on the streets. Occasionally, some ragamuffin troupe would mum a play on a street corner, or I'd hear a fiddler in a pub. But most real entertainment cost money, and my hard-won pennies were too precious to squander. But there was a problem. Dockside wasn't safe for me. I should explain. More than a year before, I had seen Pike walking down the street. It had been the first time I'd seen him since my first day in Tarbean, when he and his friends had jumped me in that alley and destroyed my father's loot. I followed him carefully for the better part of a day, keeping my distance and staying in the shadows. Eventually, he went home to a little box alley dockside where he had his own version of my secret place. His was a nest of broken crates he had cobbled together to keep the weather off. I perched on the roof all night, waiting until he left the next morning. Then I made my way down to his nest of crates and looked around. It was cozy, filled with the accumulated small possessions of several years. He had a bottle of beer, which I drank. There was also half a cheese that I ate and a shirt that I stole, as it was slightly less raggedy than my own. Further searching revealed various odds and ends: a candle, a ball of string, some marbles. Most surprising were several pieces of sailcloth with charcoal drawings of a woman's face. I had to search for nearly 10 minutes until I found what I was really looking for. Hidden away behind everything else was a small wooden box that showed signs of much handling. It held a bundle of dried violets tied with a white ribbon, a toy horse that had lost most of its string mane, and a lock of curling blonde hair. It took me several minutes with flint and steel to get the fire going. The violets were good tinder, and soon greasy clouds of smoke were billowing high into the air. I stood by and watched as everything Pike loved went up in flames. But I stayed too long savoring the moment. Pike and a friend came running down the box alley, drawn by the smoke, and I was trapped. Furious, Pike jumped me. He was taller by 6 inches and outweighed me by 50 pounds. Worse, he had a piece of broken glass wrapped with twine at one end, making a crude knife. He stabbed me once in the thigh right above my knee before I smashed his hand into the cobblestones, shattering the knife. After that, he still gave me a black eye and several broken ribs before I managed to kick him squarely between the legs and get free. As I pelted away, he limped after me, shouting that he would kill me for what I'd done. I believed him. After patching up my leg, I took every bit of rainy day money I had saved and bought 5 pints of Dreg, a cheap, foul liquor strong enough to blister the inside of your mouth. Then I limped into dockside and waited for Pike and his friends to spot me. It didn't take long. I let him and 2 of his friends follow me for half a mile, past Seamling Lane and into Tallows. I kept to the main roads, knowing they wouldn't dare attack me in broad daylight when people were around. But when I darted into a side alley, they hurried to catch up, suspecting I was trying to make a run for it. However, when they turned the corner, no one was there. Pike thought to look up just as I was pouring the bucket of Dreg onto him from the edge of the low roof above. It doused him, splashing across his face and chest. He screamed and clutched at his eyes as he went to his knees. Then I struck the phosphorus match I'd stolen and dropped it onto him, watching it sputter and flare as it fell. Full of the pure, hard hatred of a child, I hoped he would burst into a pillar of flame. He didn't, but did catch fire. He screamed again and staggered around while his friends swatted at him, trying to put him out. I left while they were busy. It had been over a year ago, and I hadn't seen Pike since. He hadn't tried to find me, and I stayed well clear of dockside, sometimes going miles out of my way rather than pass near it. It was a kind of truce. However, I didn't doubt that Pike and his friends remembered what I looked like, and were willing to settle the score if they spotted me. After thinking it over, I decided it was too dangerous. Even the promise of free stories and a chance at a silver talent wasn't worth stirring things up with Pike again. Besides, what story would I ask for? The question rolled around in my head for the next few days. What story would I ask for? I jostled up against a dock worker and was cuffed away before I could get my hand all the way into his pocket. What story? I begged on the street corner opposite the Talon Church. What story? I stole 3 loaves of bread and took 2 of them down to Trappist as a gift. What story? Then, as I lay on the rooftops in my secret place where 3 roofs met, it came to me just as I was about to drift off to sleep. Lanray. Of course. I could ask him for the real story of Lanray, the story my father had been... My heart stuttered in my chest as I suddenly remembered things I had avoided for years. My father idly strumming at his lute, my mother beside him in the wagon singing. Reflexively, I began to draw away from the memories, the way you might pull your hand back from a fire. But I was surprised to find that these memories held only a gentle ache, not the deep pain I expected. Instead, I found a small, budding excitement at the thought of hearing a story my father would have sought out, a story he himself might have told. Still, I knew it to be sheer folly to go running dockside for the sake of a story. All the hard practicality Tarbean had taught me over the years urged me to stay in my familiar corner of the world, where I was safe. The first thing I saw on entering the half-mast was Scarpy. He was sitting on a tall stool at the bar, an old man with eyes like diamonds and the body of a driftwood scarecrow. He was thin and weathered, with thick white hair on his arms and face and head. The whiteness of it stood out from his deep brown tan, making him seem splashed with wave foam. At his feet were a group of 20 children, some few my age, most younger. They were a strange mix to see, ranging from grubby, shoeless urchins like myself to reasonably well-dressed, well-scrubbed children who probably had parents and homes. None of them looked familiar to me, but I never knew who might be a friend of Pike's. I found a place near the door with my back to the wall and sank down onto my haunches. Scarpy cleared his throat once or twice in a way that made me thirsty. Then, with ritual significance, he looked mournfully into the clay mug that sat in front of him and carefully turned it upside down on the bar. The children surged forward, pressing coins onto the bar. I did a quick count: 2 iron halfpennies, 9 shims, and a drab. Altogether, just a little over 3 iron pennies in Commonwealth coin. Maybe he was no longer offering the silver talent bet. More likely, the rumor I'd heard was wrong. The old man nodded almost imperceptibly to the bartender. "Fallow's red." His voice was deep and rough, almost hypnotic. The bald man behind the bar gathered up the coins and deftly poured wine into Scarpy's wide clay cup. "So, what would everyone like to hear about today?" Scarpy rumbled, his deep voice rolling out like distant thunder. There was a moment of silence that again struck me as ritualistic, almost reverent. Then a babble burst forth from all the children at once. "I want a fairy story! Orin and the fight at Manat! Yes, Orin Valsiter! The one with Baron! Lartem! Mir Tyrinnial! Ilion and the bear! Lanray!" I said, almost without meaning to. The room went still again as Scarpy took a drink. The children watched him with a familiar intensity I couldn't quite identify. Scarpy sat calmly in the middle of the quiet. "Did I—" His voice rolled out slowly, like dark honey. "Hear someone say, Lanray?" He looked directly at me, his blue eyes clear and sharp. I nodded, not knowing what to expect. "I want to hear about the dry lands over the storm wall," one of the younger girls complained. "About the sand snakes that come out of the ground like sharks, and the dry men who hide under the dunes and drink your blood instead of water, and—" She was cuffed quickly into silence from a dozen different directions by the children surrounding her. Silence fell sharply as Scarpy took another drink. Watching the children as they watched Scarpy, I realized what they reminded me of. A person anxiously watching a clock. I guessed that when the old man's drink was gone, the story he told would be over as well. Scarpy took another drink, no more than a sip this time. Then he set his cup down and pivoted on his stool to face us. "Who would like to hear the story of a man who lost his eye and gained a better sight?" Something about the tone of his voice or the reaction of the other children told me this was a purely rhetorical question. "So, Lanray and the Creation War. An old, old story." His eyes swept over the children. "Sit and listen, for I will speak of the shining city as it once was, years and miles away." Once years and miles away, there was Mir Tyrinnial, the shining city. It sat among the tall mountains of the world like a gem on the crown of a king. Imagine a city as large as Tarbean, but on every corner of every street there was a bright fountain, or a green tree growing, or a statue so beautiful it would make a proud man cry to look at it. The buildings were tall and graceful, carved from the mountain itself, carved of a bright white stone that held the sun's light long after evening fell. Selytos was lord over Mir Terenial. Just by looking at a thing, Selytos could see its hidden name and understand it. In those days, there were many who could do such things, but Selytos was the most powerful namer of anyone alive in that age. Selytos was well loved by the people he protected. His judgments were strict and fair, and none could sway him through falsehood or dissembling. Such was the power of his sight that he could read the hearts of men like heavy-lettered books. Now in those days there was a terrible war being fought across a vast empire. The war was called the Creation War, and the empire was called Urgen. And despite the fact that the world has never seen an empire as grand or a war so terrible, both of them only live in stories now. Even history books that mention them as doubtful rumor have long since crumbled into dust. The war had lasted so long that folk could hardly remember a time when the sky wasn't dark with the smoke of burning towns. Once there had been hundreds of proud cities scattered through the empire. Now there were merely ruins littered with the bodies of the dead. Famine and plague were everywhere, and in some places there was such despair that mothers could no longer muster enough hope to give their children names. But 8 cities remained. They were Belen, Antus, Vayaret, Tenusa, Emlyn, and the twin cities of Marilla and Morella. Last was Mir Terenial, greatest of them all, and the only one unscarred by the long centuries of war. It was protected by the mountains and brave soldiers. But the true cause of Mir Terenial's peace was Selytos. Using the power of his sight, he kept watch over the mountain passes leading to his beloved city. His rooms were in the city's highest towers, so he could see any attack long before it came to be a threat. The other 7 cities, lacking Selytos' power, found their safety elsewhere. They put their trust in thick walls, in stone and steel. They put their trust in strength of arm, in valor and bravery and blood. And so they put their trust in Lanre. Lanre had fought since he could lift a sword, and by the time his voice began to crack, he was the equal of a dozen older men. He married a woman named Lyra, and his love for her was a passion fiercer than fury. Lyra was terrible and wise, and held a power just as great as his. For while Lanre had the strength of his arm and the command of loyal men, Lyra knew the names of things, and the power of her voice could kill a man or still a thunderstorm. As the years passed, Lanre and Lyra fought side by side. They defended Belen from a surprise attack, saving the city from a foe that should have overwhelmed them. They gathered armies and made the cities recognize the need for allegiance. Over the long years, they pressed the empire's enemies back. People who had grown numb with despair began to feel warm hope kindling inside. They hoped for peace, and they hung those flickering hopes on Lanre. Then came the Black of Drosentor. Black meant battle in the language of the time, and at Drosentor there was the largest and most terrible battle of this large and terrible war. They fought unceasing for 3 days in the light of the sun, and for 3 nights unceasing by the light of the moon. Neither side could defeat the other, and both were unwilling to retreat. Of the battle itself, I have only one thing to say. More people died at Drosentor than there are living in the world today. Lanre was always where the fight was thickest, where he was needed most. His sword never left his hand or rested in its sheath. At the very end of things, covered in blood amid a field of corpses, Lanre stood alone against a terrible foe. It was a great beast with scales of black iron, whose breath was a darkness that smothered men. Lanre fought the beast and killed it. Lanre brought victory to his side, but he bought it with his life. After the battle was finished, and the enemy was set beyond the doors of stone, survivors found Lanre's body, cold and lifeless near the beast he had slain. Word of Lanre's death spread quickly, covering the field like a blanket of despair. They had won the battle and turned the tide of the war, but each of them felt cold inside. The small flame of hope that each of them cherished began to flicker and fade. Their hopes had hung on Lanre, and Lanre was dead. In the midst of silence, Lyra stood by Lanre's body and spoke his name. Her voice was a commandment. Her voice was steel and stone. Her voice told him to live again, but Lanre lay motionless and dead. In the midst of fear, Lyra knelt by Lanre's body and breathed his name. Her voice was a beckoning. Her voice was love and longing. Her voice called him to live again, but Lanre lay cold and dead. In the midst of despair, Lyra fell across Lanre's body and wept his name. Her voice was a whisper. Her voice was echo and emptiness. Her voice begged him to live again, but Lanre lay breathless and dead. Lanre was dead. Lyra wept brokenly and touched his face with trembling hands. All around, men turned their heads, because the bloody field was less horrible to look upon than Lyra's grief. But Lanre heard her calling. Lanre turned at the sound of her voice and came to her. From beyond the doors of death, Lanre returned. He spoke her name and took Lyra in his arms to comfort her. He opened his eyes and did his best to wipe away her tears with shaking hands, and then he drew a deep and living breath. The survivors of the battle saw Lanre move, and they marveled. The flickering hope for peace each of them had nurtured for so long flared like hot fire inside them. "Lanre and Lyra!" they shouted, their voices like thunder. "Our Lord's love is stronger than death. Our Lady's voice has called him back. Together they have beaten death. Together how can we help but be victorious?" So the war continued, but with Lanre and Lyra fighting side by side, the future seemed less grim. Soon, everyone knew the story of how Lanre had died, and how his love and Lyra's power had drawn him back. For the first time in living memory, people could speak openly of peace without being seen as fools or madmen. Years passed. The Empire's enemies grew thin and desperate, and even the most cynical of men could see the end of the war was drawing swiftly near. Then rumors began to spread. Lyra was ill. Lyra had been kidnapped. Lyra had died. Lanre had fled the Empire. Lanre had gone mad. Some even said Lanre had killed himself and gone searching for his wife in the land of the dead. There were stories aplenty, but no one knew the truth of things. In the midst of these rumors, Lanre arrived at Mir Terenial. He came alone, wearing his silver sword and haubergeon of black iron scales. His armor fit him closely as a second skin of shadow. He had wrought it from the carcass of the beast he had killed at Drossen Tor. Lanre asked Seletos to walk with him outside the city. Seletos agreed, hoping to learn the truth of Lanre's trouble and offer him what comfort a friend can give. They often kept each other's counsel, for they were both lords among their people. Seletos had heard the rumors, and he was worried. He feared for Lyra's health, but more, he feared for Lanre. Seletos was wise. He understood how grief can twist a heart, how passions drive good men to folly. Together they walked the mountain paths. Lanre leading the way, they came to a high place in the mountains where they could look out over the land. The proud towers of Mir Terinial shone brightly in the last light of the setting sun. After a long time, Selitos said, "I have heard terrible rumors concerning your wife." Lanre said nothing, and from his silence Selitos knew that Lyra was dead. After another long pause, Selitos tried again. "Though I do not know the whole of the matter, Mir Terinial is here for you. I will lend whatever aid a friend can give." "You have given me enough, old friend." Lanre turned and placed his hand on Selitos' shoulder. "Silaneski, I bind you. By the name of Stone, be still as stone. Eru, I command the air. Lay leaden on your tongue. Selitos, I name you. May all your powers fail you but your sight." Selitos knew that in all the world there were only 3 people who could match his skill in names: Aleph, Eax, and Lyra. Lanre had no gift for names. His power lay in the strength of his arm. For him to attempt to bind Selitos by his name would be as fruitless as a boy attacking a soldier with a willow stick. Nevertheless, Lanre's power lay on him like a great weight, like a vice of iron, and Selitos found himself unable to move or speak. He stood still as stone and could do nothing but marvel. How had Lanre come by such power? In confusion and despair, Selitos watched night settle in the mountains. With horror, he saw that some of the encroaching blackness was, in fact, a great army moving upon Mir Terinial. Worse still, no warning bells were ringing. Selitos could only stand and watch as the army crept closer in secret. Mir Terinial was burned and butchered. The less that is said of it, the better. The white walls were charred black, and the fountains ran with blood. For a night and a day Selitos stood helpless beside Lanre, and could do nothing more than watch and listen to the screams of the dying, the ring of iron, the crack of breaking stone. When the next day dawned on the blackened towers of the city, Selitos found he could move. He turned to Lanre, and this time his sight did not fail him. He saw in Lanre a great darkness and a troubled spirit. But Selitos still felt the fetters of enchantment binding him. Fury and puzzlement warred within him, and he spoke. "Lanre, what have you done?" Lanre continued to look out over the ruins of Mir Terinial. His shoulders stooped as though he bore a great weight. There was a weariness in his voice when he spoke. "Was I accounted a good man, Selitos?" "You were counted among the best of us. We considered you beyond reproach. Yet I did this." Selitos could not bring himself to look upon his ruined city. "Yet you did this," he agreed. "Why?" Lanre paused. "My wife is dead. Deceit and treachery brought me to it, but her death is on my hands." He swallowed and turned to look out over the land. Selitos followed his eyes. From the vantage high in the mountains, he saw plumes of dark smoke rising from the land below. Selitos knew with certainty and horror that Mir Terinial was not the only city that had been destroyed. Lanre's allies had brought about the ruin of the last bastions of the Empire. Lanre turned. "And I counted among the best." Lanre's face was terrible to look upon. Grief and despair had ravaged it. "I, considered wise and good, did all this." He gestured wildly. "Imagine what unholy things a lesser man must hold within his secret heart." Lanre faced Mir Terinial, and a sort of peace came over him. "For them, at least, it is over. They are safe. safe from the 1,000 evils of the everyday, safe from the pains of an unjust fate. Selitos spoke softly. Safe from the joy and wonder. "There is no joy!" Lanray shouted in an awful voice. Stones shattered at the sound, and the sharp edges of echo came back to cut at them. "Any joy that grows here is quickly choked by weeds. I am not some monster who destroys out of a twisted pleasure. I sow salt because the choice is between weeds and nothing." Selitos saw nothing but emptiness behind his eyes. Selitos stooped to pick up a jagged shard of mountain glass, pointed at one end. "Will you kill me with a stone?" Lanray gave a hollow laugh. "I wanted you to understand, to know it was not madness that made me do these things." "You are not mad," Selitos admitted. "I see no madness in you." "I hoped, perhaps, that you would join me in what I aim to do." Lanray spoke with a desperate longing in his voice. "This world is like a friend with a mortal wound. A bitter draught given quickly only eases pain." "Destroy the world?" Selitos said softly to himself. "You are not mad, Lanray. What grips you is something worse than madness. I cannot cure you." He fingered the needle-sharp point of the stone he held. "Will you kill me to cure me, old friend?" Lanray laughed again, terrible and wild. Then he looked at Selitos with sudden, desperate hope in his hollow eyes. "Can you?" he asked. "Can you kill me, old friend?" Selitos, his eyes unveiled, looked at his friend. He saw how Lanray, nearly mad with grief, had sought the power to bring Lyra back to life again. Out of love for Lyra, Lanray had sought knowledge where knowledge is better left alone, and gained it at a terrible price. But even in the fullness of his hard-won power, he could not call Lyra back. Without her, Lanray's life was nothing but a burden, and the power he had taken up lay like a hot knife in his mind. To escape despair and agony, Lanray had killed himself, taking the final refuge of all men, attempting to escape beyond the doors of death. But just as Lyra's love had drawn him back from past the final door before, so this time Lanray's power forced him to return from sweet oblivion. His new-won power burned him back into his body, forcing him to live. Selitos looked at Lanray and understood all. Before the power of his sight, these things hung like dark tapestries in the air about Lanray's shaking form. "I can kill you," Selitos said, then looked away from Lanray's expression, suddenly hopeful. "For an hour, or a day. But you would return, pulled like iron to a lodestone. Your name burns with the power in you. I can no more extinguish it than I could throw a stone and strike down the moon." Lanray's shoulders bowed. "I had hoped," he said simply, "but I knew the truth. I am no longer the Lanray you knew. Mine is a new and terrible name. I am Haliax, and no door can bar my passing. All is lost to me. No Lyra, no sweet escape of sleep, no blissful forgetfulness. Even madness is beyond me. Death itself is an open doorway to my power. There is no escape. I have only the hope of oblivion after everything is gone and the Ailu fall nameless from the sky." And as he said this, Lanray hid his face in his hands, and his body shook with silent, racking sobs. Selitos looked out on the land below and felt a small spark of hope. 6 plumes of smoke rose from the land below. Mir Terenial was gone, and 6 cities destroyed. But that meant that all was not lost. 1 city still remained. In spite of all that had happened, Selitos looked at Lanre with pity, and when he spoke, it was with sadness in his voice. "Is there nothing, then? No hope?" He lay one hand on Lanre's arm. "There is sweetness in life. Even after all of this, I will help you look for it, if you will